37,000 feet above ground, and Derek had never felt more alone. His 8-month-old daughter, Rosie, was screaming, that raw, desperate kind of cry that makes strangers stare and mothers look away. Sweat dripped down his temple. His hands shook. Every passenger in rows, 12 through 18, was glaring, whispering, judging. A man in a business suit muttered something about controlling your kid. A flight attendant approached with that tight smile that meant trouble. Derek closed his eyes, pulled Rosie closer, and whispered the only words he knew. "I'm sorry, baby. Daddy's trying." Then she appeared. A woman from the row across stood up without a word. She didn't ask permission. She simply reached out, lifted Rosie from his trembling arms, and did something no stranger should ever do. The cabin went silent. Derek's heart stopped, and what happened next would change everything. The red-eye flight from Chicago to Seattle was supposed to be simple. Derek had planned everything down to the minute: the feeding schedule, the diaper bag packed with military precision, the white noise app downloaded on his phone. He had read every article, watched every video, asked every single dad in his support group for advice. 8 months of solo parenting had taught him that preparation was the only thing standing between him and complete disaster. But Rosie had other plans. She started fussing somewhere over Nebraska. By the time they crossed into Wyoming airspace, the fussing had turned into full-blown wailing. Derek tried the bottle. She pushed it away. He tried the pacifier. She spat it out. He tried rocking, bouncing, humming every lullaby he could remember from his own childhood. Nothing worked. The crying only got louder, more urgent, as if Rosie was trying to tell him something he couldn't understand. Derek felt the familiar weight of shame pressing down on his chest. He knew what the other passengers were thinking. He could see it in the way the woman in front of him kept sighing dramatically, in the way the elderly couple across the aisle exchanged knowing glances. They were thinking what everyone always thought when they saw him alone with Rosie, that he was doing it wrong, that he didn't know what he was doing, that a baby needed her mother, and he was just a poor substitute trying his best. They weren't entirely wrong. 8 months ago, Derek had no idea how to change a diaper. 8 months ago, he couldn't tell the difference between a hungry cry and a tired cry. 8 months ago, his wife Madison was supposed to be here, doing all the things that seemed to come so naturally to mothers. But Madison had held Rosie exactly once for 37 seconds in the delivery room before the hemorrhaging started, before the doctors stopped smiling, before Derek's entire world collapsed into a single devastating sentence. We did everything we could. Now, here he was, alone on a plane with a screaming baby and no idea what to do next. The flight attendant was making her way down the aisle, that practiced smile fixed on her face like a warning. Derek braced himself for the lecture, the thinly veiled suggestion that maybe he should consider taking Rosie to the back of the plane, away from the paying customers who didn't sign up for this. That's when the woman stood up. She was sitting in the row across from him, window seat, and Derek hadn't noticed her until that moment. She had dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and tired eyes that suggested she hadn't slept in days. There was a little girl curled up beside her, maybe 4 years old, fast asleep against the window with a stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. The woman didn't look at Derek. She didn't ask if he needed help. She simply stood, crossed the narrow aisle, and held out her arms. "Give her to me," she said. It wasn't a question. Derek's first instinct was to refuse. Strangers didn't just take other people's babies. That wasn't how the world worked. But something in her voice, a quiet authority that seemed to come from a place deeper than politeness, made him hesitate. And in that moment of hesitation, the woman reached down and lifted Rosie from his arms as if it was the most natural thing in the world. The cabin fell silent. Even the man in the business suit stopped his irritated muttering. Everyone watched as this stranger cradled Derek's daughter against her chest and began to hum, low and soft, a melody that sounded like something between a lullaby and a prayer. She swayed gently from side to side, her eyes closed, her lips moving as if she was having a conversation with Rosie that no one else could hear. And then, Impossibly, Rosie stopped crying. Not gradually, not in fits and starts, but all at once, as if someone had flipped a switch. She let out one last shuddering sob, then nestled her face into the woman's neck and went still. Derek watched in stunned disbelief as his daughter's tiny fingers curled around a strand of dark hair, holding on as if she had found something she'd been searching for all along. The woman opened her eyes and looked at Derek. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said, very quietly, she just wanted to be held by someone who wasn't afraid. Derek didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't sure there was anything to say. So he just sat there, watching this stranger rock his daughter to sleep, and wondered how she could possibly know what Rosie needed when he, her own father, had been failing for the past 3 hours. The flight attendant had stopped in the middle of the aisle, her rehearsed speech dying on her lips. She blinked a few times, then retreated back toward the galley as if she had witnessed something too intimate to interrupt. The other passengers slowly returned to their books and phones and in-flight movies, the tension draining from the cabin like air from a balloon. "I'm Cassidy," the woman said, settling into the empty seat beside Derek. Rosie was already asleep, her breathing slow and even against Cassidy's collarbone. "And before you ask, no, I'm not some baby whisperer. I just remember what it feels like." What feels like?" Derek asked. Cassidy's eyes drifted to the window, where the darkness outside was just beginning to show the first hints of dawn. "Being so tired that you can't see straight, feeling like everyone is watching you fail, wondering if you're ever going to figure out how to do this." She paused. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I spent the first year of my daughter's life convinced that I was the worst mother in the world. Turns out I was just the only one trying." Derek glanced at the little girl still sleeping in the window seat across the aisle. She had Cassidy's dark hair, but her face was softer, rounder, with the kind of peaceful expression that only children can manage in sleep. "Her father?" he asked, then immediately regretted it. "Sorry, that's none of my business." "It's fine," Cassidy said, though something in her jaw tightened. "He left when Hazel was 6 months old, said he wasn't ready to be a dad. Funny how they figure that out after the hard part is supposed to start getting easier." She let out a small, humorless laugh. "My mom was the only one who helped me. She moved in, took care of Hazel while I worked, held me together when I was falling apart." Cassidy's voice cracked slightly on the last word, and she looked away. "She died last week. Heart attack. No warning, no goodbye. Just gone. This flight. We're coming home from the funeral." Derek felt something shift in his chest. A recognition that went beyond sympathy. He knew that kind of loss. He lived with it every single day. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it in a way he hadn't meant anything in a long time. "My wife died giving birth to Rosie. She never got to hold her, not really. Just once for a few seconds, and then..." He couldn't finish the sentence. He had never been able to finish that sentence. Cassidy turned to look at him, and for the first time, Derek saw the full weight of exhaustion in her eyes. Not just the tiredness of a long flight or a sleepless night, but something deeper. The kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying grief alone for so long that you forget what it feels like to put it down. "So we're both doing this by ourselves," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah," Derek said. "I guess we are." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sky lighten outside the window. Rosie slept on, her small body rising and falling with each breath, completely unaware of the 2 broken people who were holding her up. Across the aisle, Hazel stirred in her sleep, mumbling something about butterflies before settling back into her dreams. "She talked about you," Cassidy said suddenly. Derek frowned. "Who?" "Rosie." "Well, not talked, obviously. But when I was holding her, she kept looking at you. Even when she was crying, she was looking at you, like she was making sure you were still there." Cassidy shifted Rosie slightly, and the baby let out a contented sigh. "She's not crying because you're doing something wrong, Derek. She's crying because she knows how hard you're trying. Babies can feel that, you know. The fear, the love, all of it." Derek felt something hot and unexpected burning behind his eyes. He blinked rapidly, turning toward the window so Cassidy wouldn't see. My wife, he said, his voice rough. She said something to me right at the end. She said, "Find someone who loves her like you love me." I thought she was talking about Rosie, about finding someone to help raise her. But now I think... He stopped, unable to continue. Now you think what? Cassidy asked gently. Derek shook his head. I don't know. I don't know what I think anymore. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing that they were beginning their descent into Seattle. The cabin lights flickered on. Passengers began stirring, gathering their belongings, preparing for landing. Across the aisle, Hazel's eyes fluttered open, and she sat up with the instant alertness that only children possess. "Mommy," she called out, her voice still thick with sleep. Then she saw Derek and Rosie, and her eyes went wide. "Mommy, there's a baby." Cassidy smiled, the first real smile Derek had seen from her. "I know, sweetheart. This is Rosie, and this is her daddy, Derek." Hazel studied Derek with the serious intensity of a 4-year-old making an important assessment. "Why is he sad?" she asked. "He's not sad, baby. He's just tired, like us." Hazel considered this for a moment, then nodded as if it made perfect sense. "My grandma went to heaven," she announced to Derek. "Mommy says she's watching us from the clouds. Do you think she can see the plane?" Derek felt his throat tighten. "I think she can see everything," he said. "I think she's probably really proud of you and your mommy." Hazel beamed, apparently satisfied with this answer. Then she pointed at Rosie, who was starting to stir in Cassidy's arms. "Is the baby going to cry again?" "I don't think so," Cassidy said, looking at Derek. "I think she found what she needed." The plane touched down with a gentle bump, and the cabin erupted into the usual chaos of deplaning. People standing before the seatbelt sign was off, yanking bags from overhead compartments, jostling for position in the aisle. Derek reached for Rosie, and Cassidy handed her over carefully, their fingers brushing in the transfer. "Thank you," Derek said. The words felt inadequate for what had just happened, but he didn't know what else to say. "I don't know how to... you didn't have to." "I know," Cassidy said. She was already gathering Hazel's things, stuffing the rabbit back into a small backpack, moving with the efficient motions of a mother who had done this 1,000 times. "But I wanted to. And sometimes that's enough." Hazel tugged at Derek's sleeve. "Are you coming to our house?" she asked. "I have toys. I can show the baby my toys." Derek looked at Cassidy, expecting her to gently redirect her daughter's invitation. Instead, she paused, her hand on the back of the seat in front of her, and met his eyes. "I'm not ready," she said quietly. "For whatever this is, whatever it could be. I just buried my mother, and I'm barely holding it together, and I don't know if I can—" "I understand," Derek said quickly. "I wasn't expecting—" But Cassidy continued as if he hadn't spoken. "I work at a café, Rosewood Cafe on Maple Street. Hazel and I are there most mornings. If you ever want to," she trailed off, then reached into her bag and pulled out a receipt, scribbling an address on the back. "No pressure, no expectations, just if you want to." Derek took the paper, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his pocket. "Rosewood Cafe," he repeated. "Maple Street." "Mommy makes the best hot chocolate," Hazel added helpfully, "with extra marshmallows." The line was finally moving, passengers shuffling toward the exit. Cassidy picked up Hazel and stepped into the aisle, then turned back one last time. "She's beautiful, Derek. Rosie, she's really, really beautiful." Cassidy's voice caught slightly. "And she's lucky to have you, even if it doesn't feel like that right now." Then she was gone, disappearing into the stream of passengers, Hazel's sleepy face peering over her shoulder until they turned the corner and vanished from sight. Derek stood there for a long moment, Rosie warm and solid in his arms, the piece of paper burning a hole in his pocket. The man in the business suit pushed past him with an impatient grunt, but Derek barely noticed. He was thinking about Madison, about her last words, about the way Rosie had stopped crying the moment a stranger held her. He was thinking about grief and exhaustion and the impossible weight of doing everything alone. And he was thinking about a little girl who wanted to show Rosie her toys, and a woman with tired eyes who remembered what it felt like. The months that followed were both endless and impossibly fast. Derek went back to work, back to the routine of daycare drop-offs and late-night feedings. He got better at the practical things: bottle temperatures, sleep schedules, grocery shopping with a baby strapped to his chest. But the loneliness didn't fade. If anything, it grew deeper. He kept the receipt in his wallet. Rosewood Café, Maple Street. Some mornings he would drive toward that part of town, park across the street from a small cafe with a green awning and flower boxes. He would watch families come and go, couples sharing pastries, mothers meeting for coffee while their children played. He never went inside. 8 months passed. Rosie learned to crawl, then walk. She learned to say dada and no and more. She was becoming a person, a real person with preferences and opinions and a laugh that sounded like bells. Derek loved her so fiercely that sometimes it hurt to breathe. But there were nights when she would cry inconsolably, and nothing Derek did could calm her down. On those nights, he would hold her and rock her and whisper, "I'm sorry, baby. Daddy's trying." And sometimes, in the darkest hours, he would think about a stranger who had held his daughter for 20 minutes and done what he couldn't do in 20 hours. He thought about Cassidy's tired eyes and Hazel's serious questions. He thought about the way Cassidy had said, she just wanted to be held by someone who wasn't afraid. He thought about her every time he passed a mother and daughter in the grocery store, every time he saw a woman with dark hair, every time Rosie reached for someone who wasn't him. On the morning of Rosie's first birthday, Derek woke up before dawn and made a decision. He dressed Rosie in her nicest outfit, a yellow dress with little daisies, and drove across town to Maple Street. The cafe was exactly as he remembered it: green awning, flower boxes, a chalkboard sign advertising the daily special. Through the window, he could see Cassidy behind the counter, her hair in a loose braid, wearing an apron dusted with flour. She was laughing at something an elderly man had said. Derek felt his heart do something strange in his chest. He almost turned around, almost drove home. But then Rosie made a sound, small, curious. "What do you think?" he asked her. "Should we go in?" Rosie blinked at him with Madison's eyes and said very clearly, "More." Derek laughed, a real laugh. "Okay, Rosie, more it is." He pushed open the door. A bell chimed. The smell of coffee and fresh bread washed over him. In the far corner sat a little girl with dark curly hair, bent over a piece of paper, coloring intently. Next to her was a stuffed rabbit propped against a chair. Hazel. She looked up. Her eyes went wide. Then she shrieked, "Mommy! Mommy, it's the airplane man! The airplane man with baby Rosie!" Cassidy nearly dropped the coffee pot. She spun around, eyes scanning until they found Derek by the door, Rosie in his arms. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Rosie wiggled, pointing toward Cassidy, and made a sound Derek had never heard before. "Ma," she said, "Mama." Derek's heart stopped. "Rosie, no, that's not—" But Cassidy was already moving, tears streaming down her face. Hazel jumped out of her chair and ran too. "You came," Cassidy said, stopping inches away. I didn't think, I almost didn't," Derek admitted, "about 100 times. "Then why did you?" Derek looked at Rosie, still reaching for Cassidy. "Because she hasn't stopped talking about you. Every night before she falls asleep, she makes this humming sound. It took me weeks to figure out where I'd heard it before." He paused. "It was the song you sang on the plane." She remembered. Cassidy's hand flew to her mouth. "That was my mother's lullaby. I didn't even realize I was—" "She remembered," Derek said. "And so did I." Hazel bounced excitedly. "Is baby Rosie going to play with my toys now?" Cassidy laughed and bent down. "Why don't you show her the crayons?" Hazel looked at Derek hopefully. "Can I hold her hand, please?" Derek set Rosie down. She looked up at Hazel with curious eyes. "Hi, Rosie," Hazel said solemnly, extending her hand. "I'm Hazel. We're going to be best friends." Rosie grabbed Hazel's fingers, and they toddled off toward the corner, Hazel chattering about crayons and butterflies. Derek and Cassidy stood watching, shoulders almost touching. "She called you Mama," Cassidy said softly. "I'm sorry. She doesn't understand. Don't apologize." Cassidy's voice was firm but fragile. My mother used to say children know things adults are too scared to see. She turned to him. Maybe she sees something we're not ready to admit yet. Derek felt the ground shift. What are you saying? I'm saying that for 8 months I've been thinking about a man on an airplane. A man who was terrified, but holding his daughter like she was the most precious thing in the universe. She stepped closer. I'm saying that Hazel asks about you every day. She draws pictures of you and Rosie. And every time I see them, I wonder what would have happened if I'd been braver. Cassidy, I'm not done. Tears fell, but her voice stayed steady. My mother used to say good men are the ones who stay. Not the ones who make promises, but the ones who stay even when it's hard. She touched his face. You stayed. For 8 months you've been doing this alone, and now you're here, and I don't know what happens next. But I know I don't want to do this alone anymore. And I don't think you do either. Derek felt something break open inside him. Not a wound, but a wall he'd built to protect himself. I don't know how to do this, he said, voice cracking. I don't know if I can. Neither do I, Cassidy said. But maybe we can figure it out together, one day at a time. She glanced at the corner where the girls giggled, covered in crayon. One butterfly drawing at a time. Rosie looked up, waved clumsily. Dada, look. I see, baby, Derek called back. The elderly man behind the counter cleared his throat. Cass, you going to introduce me, or should I keep watching like my favorite soap opera? Cassidy laughed. George, this is Derek. He's getting free coffee because you're a romantic. George grinned. Blueberry or chocolate chip? Chocolate chip. Good answer. Cass, take your break. Cassidy led Derek to a small table by the window. This is where my mom used to sit, she said, running her hand over the wood. Every morning for 20 years, George keeps it reserved for her. Derek understood. This wasn't just a table. It was a shrine, a memory, a promise. What was her name? Ruth. Ruth Ellen Foster. Cassidy smiled. She would have liked you. She would have said you have honest eyes. George appeared with coffees and muffins, then retreated with a wink. So, Cassidy said, what happens now? Derek looked at her, this woman who'd stepped into his life for 20 minutes and changed everything. He looked at the girls in the corner, already inseparable. He thought about Madison, about grief and love being the same thing in different clothes. Now, he said slowly, I'd like to hear about Ruth, and maybe you'd like to hear about Madison, and maybe I'd like to come back tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. Cassidy laughed. That might take a while. Hazel's pretty stubborn. Good thing I'm not going anywhere. Outside, the sun rose. Inside, 2 broken people sat across from each other and began, slowly, carefully, to tell each other their stories. In the corner, a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old created a drawing that would later be framed and hung in a house that didn't exist yet. But that was later. Right now, there was just this: 2 cups of coffee, 2 chocolate chip muffins, and the sound of children laughing. Right now, there was just Cassidy's hand reaching across the table and Derek's hand meeting her halfway, fingers intertwining like they had always been meant to fit together. Right now, there was just a single dad and a single mom, both tired, both scared, both hoping that maybe they wouldn't have to do this alone anymore. And in the corner, Rosie looked up from her drawing, saw her father holding hands with the woman from the airplane, and smiled, a smile that looked exactly like Madison's. "Da-da," Rosie said, pointing at her drawing. "Look, family." Derek looked at the chaotic mess of color that might have been 4 stick figures. He looked at Hazel, nodding proudly. He looked at Cassidy, crying and smiling. "Yeah, Rosie," he said, voice thick with hope. "Family." George watched from behind the counter, wiping down the same spot he'd been cleaning for the last 10 minutes. He thought about Ruth Ellen Foster, about how she used to sit at that table every morning and tell him that someday her Cassidy would find her person. "Took your time, didn't you?" he murmured to the ceiling, to the clouds, to wherever Ruth was watching from. "But I guess you always did have a flair for the dramatic." The weeks that followed felt like waking up from a long sleep. Derek came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. Some mornings he'd arrive before the cafe opened, helping George unlock the door while Rosie babbled happily in her stroller. Other times he'd come in the afternoon, and Hazel would shriek with joy, abandoning whatever she was doing to run and hug her Rosie. The two girls became inseparable. Where Hazel went, Rosie followed on wobbly legs. Where Rosie sat, Hazel sat beside her, explaining the world with the serious authority of a 4-year-old expert. "This is how you color inside the lines, Rosie. You have to be very careful. This is my favorite crayon. It's called Periwinkle. You can use it if you want. George makes the best cookies. If you smile at him, he gives you extra." And Rosie would watch with those wide, attentive eyes, taking it all in, occasionally reaching out to touch Hazel's face, as if to make sure she was real. Derek and Cassidy moved carefully around each other at first, two people who'd been alone so long they'd forgotten how to share space without apology. But slowly, the careful dance became something easier. Cassidy would pour Derek's coffee without asking how he took it. She'd learned after the 3rd day, black, no sugar. Derek would arrive with fresh flowers for the cafe tables, claiming he'd just happened to see them at the farmer's market. They talked about everything, about Madison and Ruth, about sleepless nights and impossible grief, about the way single parenthood felt like drowning in slow motion. But they also talked about small things, favorite books, terrible movies, the way Hazel insisted on wearing her butterfly wings to bed, the way Rosie had recently discovered she could say no, and used it for everything. No to bedtime. No to vegetables. No to taking off her shoes indoors. "She's asserting her independence," Derek said one morning, watching Rosie refuse to let go of a purple crayon she'd been clutching for 20 minutes. "She's being stubborn," Cassidy corrected with a smile. "I recognize the signs. Hazel went through the same phase." "Went through?" Derek raised an eyebrow. "You're saying it ends?" "I'm saying it evolves," Cassidy laughed. "Now Hazel just negotiates everything like a tiny lawyer." As if on cue, Hazel appeared at their table. "Mommy, if I eat all my lunch, can Rosie come to our house for a sleepover?" Derek and Cassidy exchanged glances. They hadn't talked about that yet, hadn't talked about what this was becoming, what it meant, where it was going. "Maybe we should," Derek started. "Work up to that," Cassidy finished. But Hazel wasn't deterred. Grandma Ruth used to say that family is the people who show up, and Derek shows up every day, so he's family. Right, Mommy? Cassidy's eyes filled with tears. She looked at Derek, and something passed between them, an understanding, a question, an answer, all at once. "Right," she said softly. "He's family." That night, after the cafe closed and George had gone home, Derek stayed to help clean up. Hazel and Rosie were in the corner, Hazel reading a picture book aloud while Rosie listened with rapt attention, occasionally pointing at the pictures and saying "dat" with great authority. Derek was wiping down tables. Cassidy was restocking the pastry case. "Cassidy," Derek said suddenly. She looked up. "I need to tell you something." His voice was serious enough that Cassidy stopped what she was doing and came over to where he stood. "What is it?" Derek took a breath. "When Madison died, I promised myself I wouldn't do this again. Wouldn't let anyone in. Wouldn't risk feeling that kind of loss." Cassidy's face went still. "But then I met you," Derek continued, "and you did this impossible thing. You took my daughter from my arms and you calmed her down and you looked at me like I wasn't failing. Like I was enough." He reached out and took her hand. "And every day since then, you've kept doing impossible things. You've made me laugh. You've made me feel like maybe I don't have to carry everything alone. You've given Rosie something I could never give her, someone who sees her the way a mother sees her child." Tears streamed down Cassidy's face. "I know it's only been a few weeks since I walked through that door," Derek said. "I know it's too soon. I know we should wait, should take our time, should be practical and careful and smart." "But," Cassidy whispered, "but I don't want to wait." Derek's voice broke. "I don't want to be careful. I spent 8 months being careful, being alone, telling myself it was safer that way. And then I walked into this cafe and saw you, And I realized safe isn't the same as alive. He pulled her closer. You make me feel alive, Cassidy. You and Hazel. And I know Madison would want that for me. For Rosie. She told me to find someone who would love Rosie the way I loved her, and you do. I see it every time you look at her. I do love her, Cassidy said, crying openly now. I love her so much it scares me. And I love Hazel, Derek said. I love the way she takes care of Rosie. I love her butterfly wings and her terrible knock-knock jokes and the way she talks about Ruth like she's still right here with us. She is, Cassidy said. I feel her here, in this cafe, watching us, smiling because she always knew. Knew what? That good men exist, that they show up, that they stay. Derek cupped her face in his hands. I'm not going anywhere, Cassidy. Not unless you tell me to. Don't go, she whispered. Please don't go. Then I won't. And then, finally, he kissed her. It was soft and tentative and tasted like coffee and tears and new beginnings. From the corner came a delighted squeal. They broke apart to find Hazel standing with her hands clasped over her mouth, eyes wide with joy. You kissed, she announced. That means you're getting married. That means Rosie's my sister now. Derek laughed. That's not exactly how it works, Hazel. But it could be, Cassidy said, looking at him with a smile that held no fear, only hope. Someday, if we're lucky. I think we're already lucky, Derek said. Rosie toddled over and grabbed Derek's leg. Dada, up. He picked her up. She immediately reached for Cassidy, who took her without hesitation, and then Hazel wrapped herself around both of them, and they stood there, this makeshift family that had been built from grief and loneliness and a crying baby on an airplane. George, who had secretly come back to lock up the register, watched from the doorway and smiled. You did it, Ruth, he said quietly. Your girl found her way home. Cree. Somewhere far above, on a plane crossing the same sky that Derek and Cassidy had crossed months ago, a baby started crying. The mother looked around apologetically, already bracing for judgment, but the woman in the seat next to her just smiled and held out her arms. May I? She asked, and the cycle continued, strangers becoming helpers, helpers becoming friends, friends becoming family, one crying baby at a time, one act of unexpected kindness at a time, one moment of courage at a time, because sometimes the unthinkable isn't something terrible. Sometimes the unthinkable is simply this, a stranger who sees your struggle and chooses to help, a hand reaching out across an aisle, a lullaby remembered from childhood, a piece of paper with an address scribbled on the back. Sometimes the unthinkable is love, arriving when you least expect it, in the form you least expect, from the person you would never have thought to look for. And sometimes all it takes is a baby who won't stop crying, and a stranger brave enough to do the unthinkable.